All right. So the topic today is sortition in businesses and organizations, a how-to guide, presented by the wonderful Ben Redhead, who presented on this topic a year ago and is here for a deeper dive into it. Now, Ben's going to give a talk, and then we're going to have a facilitated discussion. So get your questions ready. Ben's an associate at the Sortition Foundation and co-founder of INSA. He brings to the table a rich tapestry of experience. His journey as a strategy consultant, facilitator, and project manager has afforded him a unique perspective on the transformative power of sortition. He's recently launched his own organization, Sorted Collaboration, an initiative that aims to merge innovations in democracy and organizational development. And I believe he also has a blog and a website, which, Ben, if you want to put them in the chat as well, I'm sure we'll be very interested to see it. Now, without further ado, take it away.
Awesome. Thank you very much. Bear with me in the background while I share my screen, or just double checking that I'm allowed to do so. Yep. Great. Great to see everyone on the call, both new faces and old. So just as Oliver outlined, the presentation I'm going to do today about sortition and in businesses and organizations, a how-to guide. So as he mentioned before, it's a deeper exploration to kind of my own theoretical journey, which has emerged into practice over the last year or so. There's a couple of assumptions to start off with. Firstly, that people that are attending this call have an understanding of sortition and technical aspects of it. Throughout, I'll be referring to the links between deliberative democracy and also non-deliberative spaces as well. And also, just to reiterate, what I'm talking about here is sortition in businesses and organizations, referring specifically to workers, employees, and to a certain extent, members. So just to start off with, just to give a little background of my own journey. So I started primarily as an advocate through the Sortition Foundation around 8 or so years ago, which then merged into a growing interest in the advocacy, understanding of what it's about, which merged into the international network of sortition advocates. Now, naturally, at that time, I was in my fledgling professional career, working as a project manager within organizational development, and just naturally in a series of roles in a series of organizations when I'm frustrated and really confused about the way that this works, at the same time with my head being full of this marvel of sortition. So that's then merged into the fledgling idea of how can we do this better in organizations. So that linked to Sorted Collaboration, so Sorted Collab, as the logo said there. And really for the past 3 years, it's been a journey of exploration. So firstly, kind of identifying, is this stuff happening already? What I touched on the presentation last time, about a year or so ago, is not really, in very isolated pockets. Be pleased to know there is an emerging practice, which I'll touch on a certain degree of this presentation. But through speaking to people that are doing this, through thinking for it, and also thinking about models of which to apply my own work, leads to this presentation. So just to reiterate as well, you know, I'm not standing here as the advocate or, you know, the person with all the ideas and the knowledge in this space. It's very much a working process. Naturally, it will go over time. I'm purposely not an academic. I take quite a lot of pride in a practitioner, so I don't have to get bogged down in Harvard referencing and all of that type. So with that, I started this presentation kind of welcoming a challenge. This is just an introductory based on ideas, and it'll be great really to invite people to share and collaborate based on their own experiences and challenge some of the ideas that I'm put forward. So like any good consultancy, where I'm going to be referring to the how-to of sortition in organization, I'm going to use a framework, and specifically a framework with the use of an acronym. So anyone that's worked in this type of space before, you know, there's every iteration of these is a bastardization of the one that comes before. And I'm pretty sure there's some similarities that you may have seen before. But when I'm thinking a lot about how we can use sortition in organizations, it's about these 4 aspects. So firstly, the context, so understanding the context, the purpose, the participants, and then thinking about the process. So the top level questions there, your standard consultancy questions, and then the arrow down referring to the bottom will be the specific convene of questions that we might be talking about. So starting off with what's the structure, what's the problem, who's involved, and then thinking about the detail of the sortition. So that's how I'm going to go through this presentation and use that as a framework, and hopefully we'll get the opportunity to have a group discussion about specifics using this type of framework. So the first aspect is the context. So what's the structure and function of the business/organization? So ultimately the question there is, what's the pitch to make it happen as the starting point? So I see 3 kind of buckets of which there is a pitch to be made about how sortition can be used within organizations, and numbering them 1, 2, and 3 is kind of based on how, and it like the arrow says at the bottom, so how less they're aligned with models of deliberative democracy, both in the type of pitch, the design, and case studies. So I'll touch on a little bit more about what I mean by that. So the first bucket is the most obvious one, and as a result of it is where you're seeing most of the movement within the space, and that's organizations that already have a explicit democratic function. So we're talking about cooperatives, membership organization, guilds, trade unions, worker councils. I know people working in Germany, that's a big opportunity, which unfortunately we don't have in the UK. And quite simply, the pitch there is democratic innovation to improve representation. There's a large body of work around case studies, a lot of evidence base. So building on that evidence base and then thinking about how you can apply it within an organization. The examples that we're pulling up there, so cooperatives, so Simon Peck, as well as a few others in this space, has done a lot of good works to think about the applicability of sortition within the cooperative movement. Also that came up, I noticed that there's colleagues from DemNext on this call, and I was very delighted to see the recently announced project with Mondragon. And again, it's that membership organization. And also there's a few examples in the UK, pension funds and student union. So the pitch yet there is fundamentally democratic innovation, utilizing models that we already have to improve representation. The second area, and this is tended to be the focus of what trying to do it sorted, primarily because there are practitioners very much focused on this space, and it's not to rule out working with cooperatives, but thinking about how to change the paradigm a little bit, is thinking about organizations who want to better engage and empower staff. So the most obvious cases are charities, public sector, NGOs, social enterprises, and the pitch there is about that move away, or the move to genuine engagement as a result to lead to better outcomes, staff and policy decisions. And there are a few examples there. So recently, the Sortition Foundation supported WaterAid to run a process with their staff. And that was essentially about how you can better engage the staff voice within decisions. There's another example, I did say that they're few and far between, of Sodexo, where how they can engage the staff better. And another example that I'm referring to here at LSE. So LSE is in the process of working out how they can, their ESG governance. And there was a big political furore within the staff linked to the Gaza conflict and how their investments work. So they have run a sortition selection within the staff body of which to contribute to the governance decision. So that's under that bucket of how to better engage and empower staff. The third aspect, which if we're talking about that sliding scale of being aligned with deliberative democracy, is essentially for-profit businesses. So getting that pitch about for-profit businesses looking for creative innovation. Now, this is probably the least explicit and probably requires a little bit more like creativity in the pitch. But ultimately, it's about using the evidence base of cognitive diversity and how citizens' assemblies, sortition, bringing that in does allow for complex issues within a business to be solved, essentially by engaging that diversity and coming up with new ideas. So that's not a space that's in any great detail, particularly in a specific or explicit deliberative sense, but there are some emerging examples with Meta consulting their staff base in a deliberative way to get some ideas with regards to AI, I believe it was. And also there's a concept of shadow boards where commercial companies would reach out to younger employees in order to kind of get more innovative ideas of what they're talking about. So the first thing is that context, understand where we're at, what we're pitching, and enabling the kind of further conversations to happen. The next aspect is purpose. So what problem are you trying to solve? And then from a convener perspective, how this process is structured. So this is a kind of decision tree, how I would kind of consider the potential for sortition being used in organizations. Firstly, starting with that question of, is the problem you're trying to solve, is it defined? So if we're talking about no, the motivation for you having it is probably because you have an interest within sortition. You're not necessarily knowing an explicit problem. So that will be that first aspect. And then if it's a yes, that problem, so examples could be things like the climate policy, working from home. We want to review our hybrid working policy as an example. So that would be what we're talking about from the yes. If I was to follow the no path, the other consideration is there being time constraints for people participating. When I'm talking about time constraints, a lot of that revolves around buy-in. So if we're talking about there is tremendous buy-in, so if we're talking about there isn't a clearly defined problem, there is tremendous buy-in, or when I say tremendous buy-in, there is at least buy-in, right? That's the type of, when you're thinking about an employee type council, semi-permanent. If you would do it, there's not a lot of buy-in, therefore there are some time constraints. That's when you think about adapting it to more of a one-day exploratory workshop. If we're talking about yes, there is a clearly defined problem. Is there a clear output expected, such as a policy proposal? So for example, using the example of hybrid working, is that as a result of this, we want a clear policy to change, right? In that case, it'd be thinking about a smaller single issue assembly. And then that follow-up question about, are there time constraints for people participating? If there are time constraints, if there's not that much buy-in, it will be about that exploratory workshop. So we're just going to consult a small percentage selected by sortition, getting that diversity to see what people's views are with the hybrid working policy. Whereas if there isn't so much time constraint, there is that buy-in, we'll set up more of an advisory council, and it'll be an ongoing project until there is a bit more clarity, and that will require some interaction with the board level and the governance level. So that's that second aspect with regards to the process. So you've got the context clear, you've got broadly the process that you're looking at. The next thing, and focusing more on the actual sortition aspect, would be the participants. So really, the question here is, how will the sortition process be designed? Effectively, to stratify, to not stratify, is the question, as a famous writer once said. So on that question specifically, there's pros and cons within this aspect, and as I said, this is a prime example of I don't have the answers, so I'm happy to offer my opinion on this. It's this whole idea about, so what we found within the WaterAid example is that there was buy-in for it. They ran the process. The first time around, they ran the process just by chance. 3 people from the same team were in the selected to participate, and that happens, right? If you've not got any stratification. And I think if it's something that's embedded and ongoing, you know, that's something you can experiment with. But certainly if you're wanting to gain legitimacy early, I would suggest some degree of stratification. Having said that, if you're working with small numbers within an organization, you know, there is also not necessarily a need to stratify. What I'll touch on in a little bit afterwards, there are also some benefits about not stratifying, just simply about the mechanical process of sortition is a lot easier to do if you don't stratify, and to make it appealing and fun, etc. So these numbers, again, is a prime example of me kind of just instinctively saying what's right. So I'll be happily, the mathematicians among us, happily challenged. And also if someone wants to do some deep dive research into what that may be, by all means, you have my blessing. But generally speaking, it's about keeping it so the stratification process would work. So they're just some guideline numbers to thinking about when you would consider doing the stratification and how you'd consider doing that. And then within that, the stratification is this question about what characteristics need to be represented. So that's the starting point, right? And so that's about determining, firstly, what's unique about the organization, with regards to what needs to be represented, and what's unique about the question. So again, if we're talking about a hybrid working policy, you know, I would advise having some degree of stratification with regard to people with hybrid working hours. Having said that, if we're just kind of talking about a generic process, the kind of hierarchy of stratification criteria, so I would firstly prioritize organization-specific stratification categories, obvious ones such as department, you know, maybe teams, perhaps geography, depending on the organization. Then after that, start to consider work-specific, so things like seniority, time with company. And then thirdly is considered demographic. Now, demography is obviously an important consideration, and if we're talking about citizens' assemblies and engaging the public, they're often the first considerations. But within a work context, the reason why I would look to prioritize organization and work specific is just because you know, work demographies aren't like an obvious mix of reflection of society. So for example, that company could well be 80% female or 80% male. So trying to reiterate that process of stratifying for demographics might be challenging as well. Also, this is a UK specific issue, but particular demographic, it may be a UK specific, but I imagine similar countries have ideas around this, is protected characteristics. So things such as ethnicity is a protected characteristic in the UK. So what that means is that people don't have to disclose their ethnicity. So if they're not disclosing information, which leads us on to the second question, you're essentially not able to run the process. So that second question, after you've kind of had a vague of what's important, is, well, do you have access to this demographic and employee information relevant to the agreed characteristics? If it's yes, the advice would be just to send invitations directly to participants, just in the same way through the sortition process, whether it be an email or a Slack message or a mandate from the powers that be, is selecting automatically. Whereas if you don't have access to that information, be it organizational specific or demographic information, the requirement would be that need to register interest first, which again, it leads back to, you know, that's more likely to skew the respondents rather than just actually getting a genuinely reflective representation of the company that you're thinking about. And then touching with regards to the participant and the sortition, selecting some specific points. So the first thing, which links actually to when we're talking about stratification or no stratification, if you're not using stratification, there's multiple tools that you can use. Bingo, we've got a rotating wall there. There's loads of those types of stuff online. Whereas if you're doing the stratification software, if you haven't heard of it already, there is a website, panelot.org. So it uses a similar algorithm to the Sortition Foundations. It's similar people that worked on the project. And also I'd heard through the grapevine that the Sortition Foundation is currently in the process of using their open source to create a public accessible database to enable that process to run. But that's very much at the early stages, but just thought it would be necessary to mention in this case. The second one, I think this is a really important one, is make it an event. So again, non-stratification, just like in the photo there, having a spinny wheel, make it something that people are interested by. Similarly, when you're kind of making an event, I think thinking about linking it towards team meetings, things that exist already in the calendar that require that have a lot of eyes in it, is using those opportunities to run the selection and also use that opportunity to explain why we're doing this, why we're doing it in a different way. The third one here is ensure wider buy-in. So this is really important, specifically thinking about engaging middle management in larger companies in particular. So from the middle management perspective, if they're not bought into what you're doing, then there's a likely to be pushback in regards to my team member is doing this and this seems like a waste of time. So that would come through standard channels of making sure it's communicated properly, making sure that the senior leaders at least are backing the project and that kind of thing. And but the key thing is that concept is really being thought about getting that wider buy-in at the earliest opportunity. Then the fourth point is that question mark around remuneration. So as a rule, if it's beyond work hours, it's something extracurricular, then, look, certainly, just like you would do in a citizens assembly, is to remunerate people for their time. Having said that, it's thinking about how it does interact with the actual, with someone's working day. And, for examples that I have seen, there are opportunities, more annual leave, etc. That again is very company specific. But the reason I'm putting it here is just that conversation about remuneration and how that would link in. And then finally, talking about the process. So how the process will be facilitated. So the first aspect here is the role of the facilitator. Now, I think a few of the examples that I have seen didn't engage an external facilitator. I think that was largely just to make the pitch easier to senior managements, etc., is to remove a cost line, which said, yeah, sure, let's go ahead with it because it minimizes the cost. However, what then therefore happens is that the process and the outcomes are a lot slower. They reflect, a normal meeting. It's very hard to differentiate between this and a normal meeting. And in fact, what you're doing, particularly if you're stratifying or having people from across different levels of seniority, without a facilitator there, you're essentially just replicating a normal meeting, and people will automatically look over to the seniority in the room to guide that conversation. So definitely use a facilitator. Surprise, surprise, someone who's has a facilitation business is advocating for it. But genuinely, even if within the organization, it's about there might be some internal facilitators, and really establishing the role of the convener and the facilitator to understand that it is a different type of dynamic. The second here is regarding the use of technology for wider engagement. So this again was something that I was really pleased to see within the Democracy Next proposal. Essentially, this is a real good opportunity to innovate, particularly if we're talking about on small scale. So within these types of processes, I'm seeing some really good examples of the use of like platforms such as Polis. there's some really good emerging tech that I've used to great degree. One that comes to mind immediately is DemBrain, and that's about engaging the wider. So it's not just this workshop, this assembly that happens in isolation. It's engaging with the wider organization, and the more ability that you have for other people to contribute, and that will just be contribute ideas as part of the deliberation process, much like the setup of a normal deliberation. The more likely you're to get that buy-in, the more likely to have interest in the process, and the more likely to see the outcomes. But beyond the kind of dem tech tools, you know, Slack channels, Teams channels, really use technology to the optimum degree. The point here regarding the role of senior leaders, similarly with any democratic process, what we're starting to see is that senior leaders or prime ministers or presidents, etc., do play a really important role with providing that legitimacy. And so within the design of the process, you know, it might be a whole organization is thinking about how a senior leader, or in this case, it might be a specific team or department, a HR leader or whatever it may be, grants legitimacy to the process. And again, it's about similarly what we're seeing in citizens' assemblies, is that the earlier a senior leader can grant legitimacy to the process, the more accountability that they're putting to themselves, but also legitimacy to the process as well. Just on that point as well, with senior leaders, this again is just my thoughts on this, so I'm happy to be challenged, but I would avoid, particularly if we're talking about CEOs, etc., including them within the process, the selection process, on the chance that they may be selected. Just to, again, it's about keeping that balance between getting that diverse representation and also changing that governance dynamic. And then the final point is the use of expertise. And I think this is a really good opportunity, again, to use expertise both on an internal and an external basis. And when we're talking about how we can differentiate this type of process than a normal meeting or a normal like session that somebody might have as a company, is actually giving specific time and space, recognizing that within an organization there are people that have a lot of knowledge that might not be shared outside their team or circle. It's a real opportunity for them to provide that space. So that's experts on an internal basis, and also experts, whether it be a HR partner, on an external basis as well. Perhaps people that have done similar things that also other stakeholders might be able to contribute as well. So that's the 4 Ps. That's the framework that we're working with here. So thinking about context, I've forgotten it myself. Context, process, participants, context, purpose, participants, and process. And I leave you with this final slide, which in my view, this is all kind of wrapped up in. You know, this isn't just about how to, you know, make sure companies get a higher bottom line, but it's about systemic changes. I'll change that new paradigm, etc. So I'll keep that within this space, but I just thought it was a good opportunity to bring this slide in. So that brings us to the end. So what the intention was now, so it would be great to have hear people's thoughts, perhaps even thinking about people's own experiences or ideas in relation to that, and similarly happy to open to the floor to the questions. So I'll hand back over to you, Oliver.
Great. Thank you very much for that fantastic talk. So if people have questions, please use the raise hand button at the bottom of your screen, and I will shout you out. Graham, go ahead. You're on mute. You need to unmute yourself.
Sorry, thanks. It's different platforms. That was a really interesting presentation. Thanks a lot. I have a very specific question, although I think it's a generic one. Is we're actually planning to run an assembly at Westminster University with staff and students. And of course, one of the challenges here is if in terms of proportions, like the students are a mass, you know, I mean, I haven't got the figures, but, you know, they are the largest group of people. And there's a debate amongst those people who are doing these things in universities about whether you should simply have the same proportion of the different types of actors within your population, or whether you should be skewing. So there was one held in Lucerne where they had 20% 20 academics, 20 professional staff, 20 students.
Mm-hmm.
Otherwise it would have been, I don't know, 40 students, 10 professional staff, 10 academics. I'm just interested on your thoughts about that, particularly as you get more senior in a company, there are fewer people at those levels.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, usually what I'll do is I'll ask experts like you, Graham, to give me some guidance. But I'm happy to give my thoughts on this. And I suppose relating to the model, the way that I would think about it is, well, what kind of question? Are you just posing a generic, or are you wanting to set up a generic councel? Is it a climate?
So this is actually a climate assessment. So it's about, the question is going to be about the climate, about how the university can take its climate commitments more seriously.
Yeah.
So it's quite an open thing. So there's no specific anybody particular in the institution who'll have particular expertise in that. Well, obviously there are like people in the States and stuff, but it is something for the whole population. Yeah,
no, interesting. I think linking back, and then the idea is that it would be a kind of a wider council. It will be so linking back to the model that I was talking about before, it will be a specific output. That would have so it would be more of a condensed process.
It's a one-off process with the aim of it becoming something more permanent, but it's a kind of like a first stab at it. But it's this question about when you've got a very, very inverted commas unbalanced population, what you do with that.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting point, and I suppose the first thing to do, again, it's me riffing really. It'll be about kind of establishing what that differential balance is and how that links towards percentages. Once you've got that, it's about really, well, who really is going to kind of implement the levers of power in terms of to contribute to that decision. I think I naturally don't have an exact answer for this, but certainly the model that you refer to about kind of getting that balance between student staff would be something to contribute. But I think the key thing to it is not underestimating the use and benefit of rather they might not be directly involved, particularly staff members, but having staff members contributing.
No. The assembly is a mixed assembly of students and staff.
Right.
Our challenge is trying to figure out what the relative percentage of each of those should be, about whether we should just be, and it's a question for any company that has maybe a very, very large workforce and a smaller professional staff, and about how you I don't know. I'm struggling with that question about whether we should always be just mirroring the population, or whether we should be skewed. And it's kind of, especially when you're in a situation where there is one group that is so much larger than the others. So of course the strange thing is the academics and professional staff have more power, so you might want to say you will keep them as a small group. But they also will have knowledge and experience that if you don't have a large enough group of them, you won't get that diversity. So definitely.
And I suppose one more kind of thought that comes to mind in relation to this is that the students' involvements are very much there for 3 years, they move on, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Whereas
exactly.
If you're talking about someone's contribution to a university, you've got staff members, so you can make the case for staff being kind of overrepresented on a pure population case by just simply the stake that they have in this, rather than it being kind of more transitory.
Sure.
But no, it's interesting, and definitely be great to hear how that.
As I say, there's a lot of practice in France, and they're doing all sorts of different things. So it's awesome. There doesn't seem to be any answer here. Thanks anyway.
Yeah, awesome.
So
Thank you.
next we have a question from Benny, and then a question from Paul.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yep.
I've tried a little bit, you know that, Ben, with sortition inside a business, private business, and it's not so easy as it might seem, because there is a lot of resistance, and I tried in different ways. I tried, make a list and let people sign up for certain things, and it ends out that it's the normal people that ends up in the same positions as normal. So it really has to be randomly selected from the entire group. But what sort of procedure or function would you say is most best sorted or best to do with sortition in a business?
Yes.
That is something missing a little bit, but I really like your presentation.
Yeah, so I mean, I suppose with that kind of thing, it depends on the context of the organization. So firstly, the size, and secondly, is thinking about mapping the organization in the different ways that it's divided, right? So the organization itself is, again, is for perhaps to prompt me on, but there might be specific teams within the organization. So it's about basically thinking, firstly, how is the organization divided? Is it separate teams? Is it separate job roles? Is it separate functions? And then there's the inherent ones, such as, seniority, age, and other demographic features. So as an exercise, what I'd probably look to do is to do that first, and then thinking about, well, what are the kind of most implicit and impactful aspects to it? So for me, the clearest one is what team people are in, right? Because that's their social circle within an organizational sense. So that's kind of when I'm talking about the hierarchy of doing so. So yeah, as an exercise, that would probably be what I would consider doing first, is mapping where the organization is divided and trying to best to connect across that.
But I really think there is missing some sort of recipe or something like that, because it's very open right now. And yeah, that's a problem, to be honest.
Yeah.
Great. Paul?
Hi. I guess my question is, to what degree do you think there's a possibility or an opportunity to turn these assemblies to basically, expand the use of these assemblies in private organizations, and then turn them into some sort of recruitment device to get the participants perhaps somehow permanently or at least in the long term engaged with this idea of spreading deliberative democracy, sortition assemblies, etc.
Well, yeah. I mean, that's a big question, and funnily enough, that was kind of my motivation for going down this road. Well, one of my motivations. I don't think you can predict that, really. I think really what we can kind of do as practitioners and advocates is to implement these type of practices in as many possible avenues. In the last presentation that I've done, if we're talking about the whole possible span of the use of deliberative processes and sortitions, if we're just focusing within civic institutions that are engaging the public, that's a very, very small percentage of organizations or organizational forms that exist. So the more and the more the different opportunities that we're kind of putting out there, we're experimenting. Some will work, some won't work, right? But ultimately, the more opportunities that there are, the more examples there are for people to draw on. That again will certainly, in my view anyway, do no harm to the wider movement. And that's really kind of one avenue of advocacy that we can look, particularly in small circles that we can control. So yeah, absolutely agree in principle, but who knows in practice.
Right.
Hugh. All right, was off.
Thanks very much. Thanks, Ben, for the great presentation, and really great that you're working on this topic, because it's a great new frontier for the movement, as you say. I wondered if you could tell us a bit about any reading that we can do on the subject. I find it very difficult to find examples of where this has happened before. I'm aware of Dimitri Couron's work on the French military, for instance, which sounds like a really fascinating, long-term, apparently useful example for the French armed forces. Is there anything else we can read about? Thanks very much.
Yeah, so two academics that I'll point you to. So Simon Peck, who I'd mentioned before, I actually just noticed he's on this call as well. And also Aaron Game, who talked about being, so his work is focused more on worker cooperatives and small scale worker cooperatives and the use of sortition. So he'll be doing an INSA presentation. Yeah, so one of the benefits of kind of going off on this journey is finding like the niche. I call it the niche within a niche, right? And we start to think that the sortition deliberative democracy movement's a small circle. It's even smaller when it refers specifically to organizations. So there are a few examples that I can share with you directly, or I don't know what would perhaps share with the conveners of this call to send out to the people, and that will be both kind of practical examples, but also from an academic perspective, as I referred to. But yeah, ultimately, I'm always kind of on a bit of a treasure hunt. So if anyone does have so many ideas or even examples, please send them my way.
Thank you,
Jason.
Hi, yeah. Similar question to Hugh. I don't know, you mentioned some organizations using this. It would be really helpful to see the benefit as well to these organizations, so that when we are pitching, we could be, you should listen to me because others are succeeding. So I'm curious if you have, I don't know, any sort of documentation, text or written, or testimonials especially might be nice from people implementing this in your experience to share with us that may be trying to persuade others.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it kind of links back to that, it being very kind of isolated cases at the moment. That prompts is probably quite a good prompt for me to actually capture what evidence there is into a one-pager, thinking about. And for example, the water aid example is not documented anywhere. I just spoke to the person who helped convene that, and I've been kind of pestering her to get that in writing, etc. So yeah, thanks for the nudge, and yeah, I'll certainly try my best, and I encourage others to do the same.
Great. Do we have any further questions? Rich, go ahead. You're on mute, Rich. We still can't hear you. It's not ideal. Do you want to maybe type your question in the chat? Hi, Camilla. Thanks for attending. Great to have you. So while we wait for Rich to type his question, would anybody else like to bogart him?
It'd be good just to kind of use the time. I suppose a question from me to the audience as well. Does anyone have any kind of like dream examples, or perhaps where they work, or there are a member of that they exhibit, that they've actually thought about, implementing sortition? And it'd be great to hear your kind of ideas and how you thought about doing so, and happy to have an open conversation about, well, yeah, ultimately you want to make it reality.
Yeah, if people can just raise their hands for that as well. We'll start with Ian. Go ahead.
Hey, Ben, thanks so much for the presentation. It was excellent. Yeah, I do have something that I'm trying to work on for a nonprofit social welfare organization. I am on this bylaws committee for a Georgist land value tax organization in the US, and trying to develop bylaws that might incorporate sortition of the membership, just to encourage this membership organization to be reflective of the will of the members. I'll put that in the INSA Discord, but I'll put a link to it in the chat as well. But the basic idea is that we would take sortition panels on a regular basis to like annually update the strategic plan, and then annually to perform performance evaluations for each of the board members, and kind of like reducing the board size to something small that's more like an executive board of like a treasurer, a secretary, and then maybe 2 presidents, just to kind of reduce the threshold for sortition panels to be able to remove one if they think that there's a problem, so that if they do remove one, there's a good backup and institutional memory that can continue the organization if they feel it's met the threshold of removing or changing leadership. But I'll put that idea in the chat, and if anyone wants to give me feedback, I'd greatly appreciate it. Not anything that Common Ground USA has endorsed, but I'm trying to convince them all that sortition can save the world. Thanks so much again for the talk.
Awesome. Yeah, I look forward to reading that for sure. I suppose one thing that immediately came to mind from my experience of working with organizations, and particularly if you're pitching something, is if you're explicitly thinking about, yeah, we're coming out to change the power structures, that is, you're inevitably going to get pushback to that. People, especially the way that these organizations are designed, or any organization is designed, is the people that are making decisions are the people that are holding the power. So, you know, in terms of the design of that, you know, I look forward to reading that. But it's thinking about, well, what's your starter, right? How are you actually making this an interesting proposition, rather than it just being kind of like an activist piece where there's people's shoulders up and don't really want to do anything about it. So that was where I was kind of the invitation to kind of make it an event. You know, perhaps it's even just starting off with a one-off advisory panel, and then, you know, it's very difficult to start off, as we've learned if we're reflecting on the Citizens Assembly movement, starting off with the institutionalization. The institutionalization comes with time, right? So at the starting point is really, particularly there's not that evidence base, is thinking about that one-off event, thinking about making it simple, making it memorable, making it enjoyable, and making it impactful. And then from there, then kind of thinking about how it can implement to the structures. So that would be the only kind of thing that I would add to that, is to not immediately thinking about the power structures, and hopefully that comes with time.
Right. I mean, I guess that's a good suggestion.
Sorry, one thing, Rich, could you turn off your microphone, please? Rich, your microphone is switched on. Can you switch? Thank you. Sorry, Ian. One final comment, and then we'll go to Lucy.
Yeah, that's a really good point, that directly coming out with threatening the existing power structure is probably not a great move for getting institutional change. My hope is I'm going to try to sell it on like more engagement and more volunteer activity from the membership. We'll see how it goes, but I really appreciate the talk.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Lucy, go ahead.
Hi, thanks. It's really interesting to have this conversation. And I think it's also really interesting to have the conversation around things that aren't just in the assembly sphere. So how sortition can change the way decisions are made out with assembly processes. So I'm coming at this from a number of angles. Obviously, I work for Next. I've posted the link to the Mondragon project in the chat if that's of interest. But I'm also a member of the Citizens in Power Network in the UK, where there are a bunch of kind of creative organisations, arts organisations, cultural institutions who are thinking about how decisions get made in those contexts. And I think, and I also am chair of a community-led organisation. And when I look at your 3 blobs, Ben, like it is an organization with a democratic function because it has a CIO membership model. It also wants to better engage and empower staff, and it is also trying to generate profit and it's looking at creative innovation. So I guess I'm thinking of this through a number of different lenses, and in this context, for this latter example, doing an assembly, there isn't a big problem to solve that an assembly would be relevant for, but how could I use sortition and deliberation in the way that decisions are made, and how can I shift the board of trustee governance model so that it isn't just the power concentrated in those individuals led by me? That's not the way it should be. So we're going to be exploring that through the Citizens in Power Network. When I think about the membership model and I think about the organization I used to work for, which was the National Trust, which is like the biggest membership, it's bigger than all the political parties by a country mile in the UK. And it tried out doing a citizens assembly, but it didn't. I'm interested in what an assembly would look like. To Graham's example in the university, where you have the university, but also what about the membership in that decision-making process, and where does that sit? So this has just got me thinking about a lot of different things. And I think your point about having some of those little case studies that you've got there quite clearly set out and what they didn't do, because I'm also really interested in Graham's challenge around who is, but automatically I'm thinking, well, of course you have whoever your university population is, and that's that. But it isn't, as he said, it's not as straightforward as that. So it's a very random list of things, but I think it's a really interesting challenge around how businesses and organizations that do have membership models, particularly where they don't have a big, like there might be a thing. It might just be about the way decisions are made and who gets a say in those. Yeah, no,
absolutely. And I mean, it kind of linking back to what I was saying with Ian, and I know kind of why I kind of openly admitted it to this group. My motivation for this is about like power structures, etc. Right, but that is the last thing that I'm bringing forward, and it's a really kind of interesting. And I think there is one of the benefits of kind of focusing it in a non-democratic sense is that it's not implicit about power structures and who's governing who and ownership and all of that kind of stuff. And there is a real case to be made, even if we're just looking at citizens' assembly evidence, to suggest, when we're talking about empowerment, right, when we're talking about creative solutions, all of these always drip through. And I suppose there is a gap about translating it. And I find the thing that always frustrates me, which I find it quite funny, is that every organization, every sector thinks that they're unique and they've got like unique challenges, etc. But generally working across different sectors, you find out it's all the same thing. It's all the same bloody thing. You've just got like outdated power structures and all of this kind of stuff. And the issues are always the same. So yeah, no, I mean, yeah, I certainly don't have the answers. Hopefully really the idea was just to kind of create that space to think about. And as I said right at the very beginning, it's an ongoing conversation. So yeah, an invitation to continue that, and happy to continue that on any degree.
Awesome. Do we have one final question before we wrap up? Since it's 5:2 right now.
I'm going to give Rich one last chance to turn his mic on.
Mike, can you hear me?
Hey.
I'm not gonna ask the question. It's more of a scenario and wanted your advice on it, but I can do it outside of here. Will you be sharing your slides?
Yeah. What I'll do is I'll share my slides. So probably tomorrow morning, I'll share my slides, and also the list of that I've started to collate of kind of relevant reading and examples. Which again, if people have other things to add. It'd be great to
if you share with me, I can try to make them available to all the participants and put them on both Discord platforms. So
yeah, for sure.
And if somebody wanted to contact you individually for consultations and so forth, is that a possibility?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll just send my contact information. I'm easily found on LinkedIn. It says Benjamin here, but I'll be Ben Redhead. There's not many other Ben Redheads in the world, so you should be able to find me through that. And yeah, my email is ben@sortofcollaboration.org. And yeah, I mean, whether it's just a continuation of the conversation, talk it through or whatever, I'm happy to collaborate in any which way possible.
And one last comment, if I can, as Oliver mentioned at the beginning of this session, we're hoping to get Dr. Gain here, who will be speaking on similar topics. So keep your ears open and an eye out for a future presentation that will probably be of interest to most of the people that are here today. Thanks so much, Ben.
Yeah, pleasure. Look forward to continuing the conversation.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks again to Ben. Thanks for everyone for being here. This, I think, has been really fascinating. Seen some stuff in the sortition space that we don't see so often. So yeah, really exciting stuff.